Well, welcome all, and thank you for joining me this Research Ethics Week. My name is Alicia Hoflick-Moore, and I work in Lattice within the College of Liberal Arts, the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And I'm going to be presenting today on some collaborative work done with some of my wonderful colleagues in the libraries, Valerie Collins and Shanda Hunt, on practices and considerations for sharing research data collected from or about human participants. All three of us work as curators for our own institutional repository, the data repository for the University of Minnesota, or DRUM. And so I'll be talking about how our policies and practices have been changing as more requirements and guidelines for sharing human participant data have emerged. I will note that you can find my slides at this Z link, so z.umn.edu/human data sharing. And I think Jennifer is recording this talk, so it'll be available afterwards. And I welcome questions throughout. You can put those in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute too, that would be fine by me. All right. Okay, so let's start out with reasons why researchers would want to share data from human participants. So in addition to disciplinary movements towards open science and reproducible research, much of the impetus for sharing is due to mandates. So specifically, there are many journals in a growing number of disciplines that are requiring data that underlie a published article to be shared. And so this is either by requiring data to be deposited to a repository that gives a permanent URL or digital object identifier so it can be cited, or by including a data availability statement, making it clear how interested people can request the data. Sometimes this can be peer reviewed as well, along with the manuscript for journals. Other requirements for data sharing come from funding agencies. And so many of them, as you're submitting grants, folks need to write in their submission, in their grant application, plans for managing and sharing their data. And so there are varied levels of implementation among the different funding agencies. One in particular that is changing is the policy for funding coming out of the National Institutes of Health, or NIH. Its current policy was implemented in 2003, and it only applied to grants above a certain size, so that had more than $500,000 in annual direct costs. And then these requirements were to just include a plan about how the data would be shared or explain why data sharing wasn't possible. And so myself and some of these plans, I've seen plans that were funded that simply said data from the study will not be shared due to privacy reasons. And that was their data sharing plan. And so given progress in both, I think, the culture of data sharing and also the infrastructure for sharing and protecting sensitive data, this kind of reasoning for not sharing is no longer seen as valid for many of the funders and journals. And so as such, NIH has a new data management and sharing policy that's going to come into effect in January of next year. And this will require data sharing as well as data management plans for all grants, regardless of funded amount. There will also be compliance mechanisms in place, and PIs will be required to report on progress and actual sharing outcomes. The specific requirements are very similar to what's already been in place for over a decade now for grants from the National Science Foundation, or NSF. But now this is going to impact researchers who collect sensitive human participant data even more extensively, because that's the kind of research that NIH funds. So they're not necessarily new requirements, but they're going to be applying to a lot more people and a lot more people who are sharing data from humans. So as many more people will be impacted by data sharing requirements, I just want to emphasize that what counts as sharing for funders, for journals, are actually a wide spectrum, from restrictive to fully open. So on the more restrictive end, people who are interested in using existing data that's restrictively shared, may need to submit an application. They may have to undergo screening. They may have to have certain affiliations, such with a research institute or university. And they may have to access the data through either a secure enclave or actually going to a physical location. On the other end of the spectrum is fully open data sharing. And so this is data that may be able to be downloaded and used by anyone with an internet connection. The important point here is that the presence of the data or the metadata information about the data is findable, and how to get access to the data is clear, is what would count as sharing, but the actual data might be restrictive or fully opened. And just to give you some examples of different repositories that exist for data and the different sharing mechanisms they have. So one example is ICPSR, which stands for the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research. And so this is a repository that has a public level of data sharing through their open ICPSR. They have data sharing that requires affiliation with a member institution, and they have mediated access data in their repository. And so the restricted access data can be in the form of a secure download, a virtual data enclave, such that people need to submit applications and then connect to a remote computer to access the data. It could be a physical data enclave, so they have certain data sets where people need to go physically to the basement of their building in Ann Arbor, Michigan to use the data. And they also have a survey documentation and analysis system, which is a way that people can do some basic data analyses with data that exists just online. So without ever getting access to the individual level data, they can still run some analyses on it. I will note that University of Minnesota is a member of ICPSR, so people here can both access the member-based data and deposit their data in this repository. Another example is one of the NIH recommended data repositories. So this is for the National Institute for Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases, or NIDDK, Central Repository. So this Institute of NIH takes data that are funded by them, and it offers restricted access. So users have to register, log in, and apply, and are verified in order to get access to the data. They also have some requirements for people who are submitting data to that repository, and I'll be talking about these requirements a little bit later, but the submitter has to verify that they have consent to share. They review the submission, and there is guidance available for the consent language. So that's another restricted data repository. On the other end, so our own repository at the University of Minnesota, DRUM, is a public access data repository. And so this means that data are available and anyone can find them and download them for use. And we do, even though we are a public repository, we do house some data from human participants. So on the screen is an example from a psychology lab here in the Gordon Legg Lab of data from an experimental study. And so our repository, just to give a little more background of it, if you're not familiar, it's public facing, but it's also curated. And so what that means is when people deposit data and they want to share their data via our repository, they're assigned a disciplinary or data expert, and they review the files. And so we do ask for data that were collected from humans, that we have an IRB consent form, and we review that. And we also look at the files. We will run analysis scripts or other scripts to make sure they run without error. We'll review the files to ensure they're in archival formats that are best for long-term access and preservation. And we, like most data repositories, will assign a digital object identifier. So that will allow it to be cited and found. So given the vast range of data repositories available, and the coming requirements for more researchers who collect data from human participants to be sharing those data. One thing I want to talk about are the ethical considerations that are taken into account when a researcher is selecting a data repository and making decisions about where to share their data, or from our end too, as people who work for a repository to be intaking data. And so we know that most NIH disciplinary repositories are restricted, so they don't have public access to the data. We also know, and I'll show you how we know in a little bit, but most repositories that are both restricted and open do have information about de-identification and requirements that data are de-identified before they're shared. Many NIH, but not most general repositories, have requirements around informed consent. Specifically, what did the researcher tell participants would be done with their data? And so whether they were told that it would be shared, whether they told that it would be shared in the way that particular repository is sharing, or whether they would be told it would not be shared at all, or even worse, destroyed. And so this is tricky, and this is the piece I'll be focusing on today, because data sharing isn't the norm yet for data from humans, and because IRBs are submitted long before data are complete and ready for sharing, sometimes years, and sometimes before you know what journal you're going to be submitting to, and whether they even have a data sharing requirement at the time of IRB submission might be different than at time you're ready to publish. So it's critical to be thinking about informed consent ahead of time, and specifically making sure that it aligns with the plans for the data. And so participants are being told what will happen to their data when data sharing happens. And so this is a question my colleagues and I had as we were navigating in Drum how we handle data from human participants in our own repositories. So we want to know what is happening across other repositories. We know that de-identification or not having any private data is kind of a standard in the repository language. But what are people doing around consent? Are people asking for consent? Are repositories looking for consent? Are there guidance on their websites? And so we did a scan to look at the landscape. And so our initial criteria was to identify repositories that ingested or collected or housed data from humans. And so our goal was to analyze the language related to consent, both on their website as well as in the deposit agreement, which is the specific thing that someone who is putting their data in a data repository would sign and read over and agree to, and how that data would be used. So we gathered an initial list of repositories, and this work was done a couple of years ago, 2019 to 2020. And then we narrowed based on the presence of human data and also mention of consent on their website or deposit agreements. And so just to show you where we started and where we ended. So this is a slide that goes through our initial list. And so initially we looked at repositories that were in the data curation network. And so this is a network of then 11 institutions that have institutional repositories that are curated like ours, and Minnesota is a member of this. And then we share a network of curator expertise to curate different kinds of data that come into our individual institutions. So we took all of those repositories. We took repositories within our fellow Big Ten Academic Alliance schools that are institutional. We looked at repositories that were recommended by the Journal PLOS One for depositing and data. We looked at the NIH list of recommended repositories. And finally, we looked at well-known general repositories that house data. And so after deduplication, because some of those overlapped, we had about 100 repositories, and then we dove into each of them to look at whether or not they specifically say they take human participant data. We found that 60 of them did or contained it somehow. And then we look closer at each of those websites to see whether they had any mention of consent in their policy, deposit agreement, or website anywhere. And of those 60 that took data from human participants, only 19 had any mention of consent in those. And so that alone was very, very few mentioned consent. And so just some general takeaways of analyzing the ones that did mention consent is that most repositories that do, they provide explicit language in the consent form. And so they'll provide template language for folks to use if they will be submitting an IRB consent. But there was enormous inconsistencies in how the consent process is labeled and located, where on the website it mentions consent, the level of detail provided. Most of these were not formalized policies, so it was unclear whether the repository had a policy of requiring consent or evaluating consent. Some of them were under guidelines or just best practices. And the real key here is that there wasn't really clearly documented rejection mechanisms or unclear enforcement. So what would a repository do if they got a consent form that had restricted language, or what would they do or recommend if someone wasn't able to produce or didn't explicitly say that data would be shared? And the other thing we noticed is that the repositories that did have guidance tended to be those NIH-specific repositories because they were collecting data within a specific field, generally medical and clinical research. And so they had very strict requirements on consent. And most of those people would know that they're depositing there when they were collecting their data. But institutional and general repositories, even those that took data from human participants, often have broad collection scopes and really tended to only address the presence of personally identifying information, or PII, or confidential information and guidelines, stating that those had to be removed. And so, yeah, a lot of inconsistencies in how these are referred to. And so thinking back to our own repositories, so we were one of the repositories that accepted data from human participants, but at that time when we were doing the scan, we did not have a policy or guidelines or anything about what was required from researchers submitting this data. And so we were one of those, 40 institutions or repositories that weren't reviewed because we didn't have any information about what we did. But because we were aware of the importance of consent, we were in practice making it a practice to request the consent form whenever we had a submission that appeared to contain information about human subjects or human participants. And we were evaluating on an ad hoc form. We would request the consent form or information sheet or anything that came in front of the participant, even if it wasn't necessarily reviewed by the IRB. And we were evaluating the consent language around how that data would be used and shared, and then we would advise the submitter on how to proceed with data sharing and if we had recommendations. And so just to give you an idea of the extent to which we house data from humans and our decisions around this. So DRUM has been in existence since 2013. And we have, as of a couple weeks ago, 667 accepted data sets. And so what that means is once a data set is submitted, it gets reviewed by our DRUM coordinator, Valerie Collins, and then if it has human data in it, we ask for their consent form, and then that's further reviewed by Shanda and myself and Valerie, and then we would accept it if there weren't any concerns, and we would usually follow up if we had any. And so in that process, about 60 of those 667 accepted data sets are data that are contain information about human participants. And we've had 3 in this process that we have rejected due to various reasons, consent being one of them. And so just to give you an idea about some of this language, I want to show you some examples of language we see in consent forms. So this is a real example from one we saw. So this consent form said, you may be assured of complete confidentiality. Any contact information you provide will be used for validation purposes only and to identify multiple respondents from the same organization. The data will be reported only in the aggregate and no individual or institution will be identified. Taking part in this survey is completely voluntary. So just actually, if I could get like a show of thumbs up, thumbs down, or the yes, no response. What do you think in terms of the appropriateness of this language? Should it go in a public access repository? And this was the individual level data was submitted. So if you want to just respond with the no or yes, I see one no. Or you can also put it in the chat as well. Yeah, thumbs down. Thumbs down. Yep. No, it depends. Yep. So it depends. And no. Yeah. And so our decision in this case specifically was, was to reject. So we felt because they were submitting individual level data, and they said specifically that the data would only be reported in aggregate, that it was too restricted to make individual level survey responses available. And so what we recommended, we never say no and just no. So we directed the researcher to the IRB to submit a change in protocol, possibly either get them to approve sharing without reconsent or reconsenting. And the researcher pushed back, given that they had been said that their research wasn't actually human subjects research by the IRB. And so it wasn't regulated by them. And so we advised them that it was still an ethical obligation to follow the data plan laid out by participants. So regardless of regulatory requirements, they still had an ethical requirement to follow what they said to their participants. Another example, so the records of the study will be kept private and any story report we publish will not include information that make it possible to identify a subject. Research records will be stored securely and only researchers will have access to the records. Study data will be encrypted according to university policy for protection of confidentiality. So just get an idea. What do you all think on this one? I see some no's. Yeah, and so Melissa makes a good point. So DRUM is public access, so anyone can access. You don't have to have a research affiliation. You don't have to be just for research. You can use it for teaching. You could use it for playing data. You could use it for whatever. Yep. Yep. Yeah, then no. And this is something we see quite a bit. And yeah, we made the same decision. We rejected this one too. And just the confidentiality statement was a blanket statement. The one thing we said that refers to records and reports, not data. States data will be encrypted. I think importantly too, that states that only researchers can have access to the data. So our particular repository can't support that. So we talked about sending to the IRB to change in protocol, met with researchers about reconsenting. The other thing we have done in this situation is redirect them to other repositories that do have restricted access where they can ensure that the data will be used for research purpose only or for researchers only that have some sort of vetting. So that's often what we do in this situation as well. We have had several success stories. And so this is an example where, we've had concerns about restrictive language in the consent form. We've contacted the submitter And they were very eager to revise their consent and thankfully still had contact information for their participants. And so what they did is redid their consent form and reconsented their participants. And so provided some contextual background on why they're sharing their data, what they're sharing so that they're being public. They had transparency in how the language was changed. So highlighting that the original data said that research records will be stored securely, it'll be encrypted, and reiterating that they will be information that directly identifies you will be encrypted and stored securely, but other non-identifying information might be shared publicly. And this particular example required a signature like the original. And so one of the things we wanted to do to move DRUM forward, and so even though we've had these practices in place, we've been looking at consent forms, even as, you know, some folks mentioned here, it depends. So this language isn't black and white. It's not cut and dry. We're making decisions. And we're making case by case decisions. And so there was no information on our website about it. There was no clear rubric on how we were making these decisions. So one of our goals was to develop a human participant data policy and related guidelines. And so what this does for us and for people who want to submit to DRUM is it helps us as curators have consistency in decisions. So what are we looking for? Where is it falling short? How do we decide? How do we evaluate whether it's appropriate to accept or not? Clear guidelines for people who are submitting, and also transparency in our evaluation process. What are the things that are weighing into our decisions, and how do we evaluate them? And so we now have a policy on our website as of last fall. So I have the link on the page here, and I just want to give an overall highlight of some of the key points. And so this policy makes it explicit that people who are submitting data about human participants must provide the consent form or similar. So even if it wasn't deemed human subjects research by the IRB, any kind of something they put in front of participants that told them what would be happening to their information, we want to see. We'll have a curator evaluate whether the data set would be de-identified, whether it has been de-identified sufficiently. We also wanted to make sure to tell people that we may recommend additional de-identification steps. This is, again, something we had been doing for a while, particularly in combinations of indirect identifiers that may not have been sufficiently de-identified, and just letting people know that we might be recommending this. Checking that the consent form or similar is free of restricted language. So examples of restricted language like we've seen before, data will only be shared in aggregate, data will only be seen by the research team, data will be destroyed, things like that prevent sharing of individual level data. We want to make sure that the consent form states that individual level data will be shared instead of promising it in the aggregate. And ideally, we want the consent form to state that the data will be shared publicly. So not only to researchers or not only to a subset that our repository can't actually implement. And of course, because, right, there are templates for consent forms, a lot of folks have just been using the same consent form or language for a long time, or didn't know they needed to share when they were writing it. One of the things we also wanted to make really transparent is, what do we do if a data set comes in that doesn't meet this criteria, or we have issues that are gray? So one of the things we're going to do is curators will evaluate, and it will be a group of curators, evaluate the language in the consent form versus potential harm caused by sharing without participants' knowledge. So data sets that may cause a lot of harm and people might not be comfortable with, that are really sensitive without their knowledge, might need a higher bar for openness and transparency than data sets that are really benign. So one thing we will say, if the data set are de-identified completely and not sensitive at all, and the data and the consent form doesn't quite meet all those things, we will likely accept it. But we do mention that there are conditionals. So we'll accept it with the goal of educating and helping a researcher or team have more transparent language in the future. So anytime we notice problems with the consent form, we will have consultations on future consent form language. We'll share our data sharing information sheet, which we recommend including alongside a consent form to give more information about what data sharing is, why it's important, what a repository is. We also wanted to include some boundaries here too, because something we've noticed is that these consultations without any I think consequence or timeline on it. We were getting many submissions from similar research labs that had the same language without any kind of change. And so one thing we wanted to put in there is after kind of 2 educational opportunities, if someone's had the opportunity to improve their consent form, but continue to submit to our repository without improvements in their consent form, we may reject it or refer to more restrictive repositories that are more appropriate for the consent language that's in there. If data are unable to be de-identified sufficiently or are sensitive compared to the consent, we're going to recommend reconsenting or redirect to a restricted access repository that has better infrastructure to protect that information and be in line with what participants were told. The other thing we want to highlight is if we see that a certificate of confidentiality is mentioned, which is something researchers can get from federal agencies in order to protect the privacy of private sensitive individual information from being subpoenaed or accessed by police or any other reasons, then the language about data sharing in DREM would have to be very explicit, or else we would reject and refer to other restrictive repositories. So just to give you a sense of better language to use for consent, so I showed you some examples of not so good language, so some better language. Some older consent forms, especially if you had audio or video data, had information about when you would be destroying the data. And so instead of having blanket statements, and destruction is needed, be really specific. So you might destroy the direct identifiers, you might destroy linking information, you might destroy identifying audio files, but things that would be retained, preserved, and shared would be de-identified transcripts or other pieces. Instead of saying responses would only be seen by the research team, saying, again, being specific about what pieces will be kept confidential or encrypted and what pieces might be shared more broadly. So identifying data will be kept confidential, only de-identified data will be shared with others. Also, we've seen a few consent forms that said data would only be shared in aggregate. And so if you want to share individual responses, be sure to have something like individual responses will only be shared in ways that will not identify you. So language that doesn't preclude sharing. So all of these also had language about de-identification and making sure that's de-identified and assuring that's de-identified. And I just want to note that de-identification is a really complex topic too. And so this is another thing that's not black and white or yes or no. And so de-identification itself is often called scrubbing or cleansing instead of de-identification, just to better highlight the fact it's a process. There's effort involved to make it less identifying, but it's not necessarily going to be perfect. The most concrete guidance that the university follows, and that's out there in general, is for health information protected under HIPAA. And that gives 2 methods of de-identifying to make that not be considered protected health information anymore. The safe harbor method, which is removing 19 identifiers, or through expert determination of sufficient de-identification. The 19 identifiers is typically what's used, but problematic for a lot of social science data and other human subjects data. is the 19th or last identifier that's any other potentially identifying code. So this could be any combination of any other indirect identifier not mentioned on the previous 18. The other challenge is that the common rule used by the IRB doesn't necessarily provide specific guidance on what it means to be de-identified. And so it does define identifiable private information, so could be readily ascertained by the investigator associated with the information, so getting at these indirect identifiers, but there's no specific guidance there either. So when thinking about data sharing, especially public data sharing, really need to think beyond what the investigator might be able to identify. And so I just want to give you a model, and this is by El Iman, and this is a what is used for some of the training on the expert de-identification methods under HIPAA, but I think this model applies really well to other data sets outside of health information. And so what's sufficient kind of depends on the situation that's being shared. So what's in the data set? How sensitive is it? What type of information is there? What's the injury to participants if that information is disclosed? And also the appropriateness of consent. So were they told that this information would be shared in this way? The other thing is the disclosure risk. So what's in there that could identify participants? And so this is a probabilistic calculation that depends on the indirect identifiers, sometimes called quasi-identifiers, and the number of people within a data set that have the same values of combinations of those, and those are called equivalence classes. And whether the data is a sample or a registry. And this is about the probability that a given person would be in the sample or in the data set or not. And finally, the audience matters. So whether it's shared with trusted colleagues versus a data use agreement, which is some of the restricted repositories use these, versus shared publicly, which is something like Drum, we have to take a pretty high bar in what would be sufficiently de-identified. So we sometimes have suggestions just to really make sure that it would be unlikely to identify a participant. And so to give you some examples of recommendations we use for data we see, we would often recommend removing risky, low utility variables. So obviously direct identifiers shouldn't be in a public data set. Those can sneak in. We've seen them sometimes in free response comments that someone just mentions their name or something really identifying. Geographic or location information, date information, these are sometimes risky, and they're also usually not analytically terribly useful. Sometimes they are. The other thing we primarily do is suggest recoding or collapsing categories with small frequencies. So if we have really small numbers in certain age groups or race or ethnicity or the combinations of those, then to recode so that we don't have as many possible small groups of people with those categories, the same values. And one thing we do too is we also review possible links to external files. So this can include social media, a study website or groups, news articles, publicly available information about the study that could help narrow down the pool of people who might be in that data set. And so I like to say that we have a lot of sketchy internet searching, trying to de-identify data sets to find what we could find. Other recommendations that we might redirect them to another repository for, or they might release a subsample of data. Usually data we get are already samples, so this is less common of a recommendation, but sometimes we do suggest they share through restricted access methods if the removal of these variables really damages the reuse of that data set, or if it's just really difficult to remove these and de-identify. Some examples of de-identification issues we've seen in Drum. So we had one submission about that was de-identified, but it was about balance on a ship. So they had information gathered from this crew of a ship, and they had specific details in the README file about the time and location of the ship, and this was a Navy research vessel. And so these ships and trips have detailed logs and the staffing available online on that research site's website. So given the date in the data set and the logs available online and the combination of gender plus the year's experience on board a ship, we could triangulate to find with that online information which person was which with pretty good certainty. So we recommended putting the demographic data in aggregate instead of at the individual level, so it's harder to connect those individual cases with people. We also had a drum submission that had daycare providers in Minnesota. And so this had both the location of a daycare provider as well as ethnicity of the daycare provider. And so especially in more outstate locations, there may not have been very many people with certain ethnicities. And so who also run a daycare. So that would be very easy to possibly identify, even though there's no directly identifying information in there, especially because licensing information is also available publicly online associated with names and locations of daycare. So that can be cross-referenced. Finally, this example comes from one of my colleagues, Shanda Hunt's research. And so she did interviews about sexual health in the Somali community. And so some of her data, and she had a lot of qualitative data, but in that community she studied, there were sometimes people could be indirectly identified from a combination of marital status and age within a small community. For example, a single female with a master's degree within that community is very rare. So if they just had those two pieces of demographic information, it would be pretty easy to determine who that person was. All right, so that is what we think about in DRUM, how we're approaching data from humans. I do want to leave you with some additional resources. So if you're interested in submitting to DRUM or you have data you want to share publicly or just talking about ways to share your data, there's a Submit to DRUM link. The IRB toolkit has a lot of really good resources on consent forms and planning and things you use for our IRB submissions. There's also a lot of great guidance from other places on language to use in consent forms, such as from TalkBank's tiered consent, so how to give people options on how much they want their data to be de-identified. Syracuse's qualitative data repository is guidance for IRB consent forms. And ICPSR has a guide to social science data archiving and preparation that has a lot of really good resources on what to think about if you need to be sharing your data. So with all that, I just want to thank you for attending, and I would love to take any questions that people have, and to also thank my collaborators, Shanda and Valerie, who I think are on the Zoom as well. And again, these slides are available at that Zoom link.